The certified letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in March, and I nearly threw it away thinking it was another debt collector. Instead, it contained news that would unravel everything I'd spent the last 18 years believing about myself as a mother, a woman, and a decent human being. My twins, Chloe and Mason, had legally changed their surnames from Whitmore, my second husband's name, back to Kellerman, their biological father's name. The father I'd spent nearly 2 decades convincing them was dangerous, unstable, and better left in their past. The same father who, according to the private investigator's report attached to the legal documents, had just sold his tech startup for $52 million. I'm Aubrey Gray, and this is the story of how I destroyed the most important relationships in my life because I couldn't face the truth about my own failures. It started in 1998 when I was 24 and thought I had life figured out. I'd graduated from community college with a degree in business administration, landed a decent job at a local marketing firm, and was dating Fletcher Kellerman, a quiet, intense man who worked in computer programming, back when that meant something completely different than it does today. Fletcher was brilliant in that understated way that made people uncomfortable. He could solve problems that left others scratching their heads, but he struggled with small talk and office politics. He preferred spending evenings reading technical manuals or tinkering with computers to going out for drinks with colleagues. I found it endearing initially, this man who seemed to exist in his own world of logic and possibility. We moved in together after 8 months, and I got pregnant almost immediately. When I told Fletcher, he didn't propose or panic or do any of the dramatic things you see in movies. He simply nodded and said, "We'll make it work." That should have been my first clue about how differently we approached life's complications. The pregnancy was difficult. Twins, the doctor announced at our 12-week appointment, and I watched Fletcher's face go pale, not with joy or excitement, but with what I now recognize was overwhelming anxiety about providing for 2 children on his modest programmer's salary. "We can't afford this," he said quietly on the drive home. "We'll figure it out," I replied, but I was terrified too. Fletcher threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He'd come home at midnight exhausted and distant, only to disappear into his home office for another few hours. He was building something, he explained when I complained about his absence. A program that would help small businesses manage their inventory more efficiently. It could change everything for us, he'd say, eyes bright with a passion I rarely saw anymore. But I was 24, pregnant with twins, and desperately lonely. I didn't want to hear about algorithms and market potential. I wanted a partner who would rub my feet and ask about my day and get excited about cribs and baby names. The babies came in February 1999, Chloe first, then Mason 20 minutes later. Fletcher was present for the birth, holding my hand and crying when they placed our children in his arms. For a moment, I thought we'd found our way back to each other. Instead, the demands of caring for 2 infants only highlight how differently we handled stress. Fletcher approached parenting like a project to be optimized. He created schedules, researched sleep training methods, and bought books about child development. He was devoted but systematic, checking items off lists rather than simply being present. I wanted spontaneity, warmth, the kind of messy, emotional parenting I'd imagined. When the babies cried, Fletcher would methodically work through his mental checklist: diaper, hunger, temperature, fatigue. When they cried in my arms, I just held them and cried too sometimes. "You're doing great," he'd tell me, but it felt like a performance review rather than reassurance. The real problem started when Fletcher lost his job. The small tech company where he worked went under, common enough in those days. And suddenly we were living on my salary alone with 2 6-month-old babies and a mortgage. Fletcher spent his days sending out resumes and working on his inventory management program, which he was convinced would eventually support our family. I spent my days at work, then came home to crying babies and a partner who seemed more invested in his computer screen than our reality. "Maybe you should look for something more stable," I suggested one evening after another rejection letter. "Something that pays better." "This is going to work," he insisted. I just need more time. Time was exactly what we didn't have. The mortgage was 3 months behind, our credit cards were maxed out, and I was exhausted beyond description. I started working extra hours, leaving Fletcher alone with the twins more often. When I came home, I'd find him at his computer while the babies played in their cribs, content but ignored. "They're fine," he'd say when I pointed this out. "They don't need constant entertainment." But I did. I needed conversation, affection, and partnership. I needed to feel like we were building something together instead of just surviving in parallel. That's when I started noticing Julian Whitmore. Julian was everything Fletcher wasn't. Outgoing, financially stable, emotionally available. He worked in sales at a competing firm, and we'd met at a conference. He was recently divorced, charming, and genuinely interested in my life, in a way that Fletcher hadn't been for months. The affair started slowly, coffee meetings that turned into lunch meetings that turned into long conversations about dreams and disappointments. Julian listened when I complained about Fletcher's distance, his obsession with his programming project, his inability to prioritize our family's immediate needs. "You deserve better," Julian would say, and I believed him. The end came faster than I'd expected. Fletcher found Julian's business card in my purse with a personal note on the back. He didn't yell or demand explanations. He just looked at me with this expression of complete devastation and asked, "How long?" "It's not what you think," I lied. "How long, Aubrey?" 2 months, I whispered. He nodded slowly, then went to his office and closed the door. I heard him making phone calls, to his brother, to a lawyer, to his mother. When he emerged hours later, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "I'll move out this weekend. We'll work out custody." That's when my panic set in. I couldn't handle 2 babies alone, couldn't afford the mortgage on my salary, couldn't face the judgment of family and friends. So I did something unforgivable. I started telling people that Fletcher had been distant and cold throughout our relationship, that he'd ignored the babies, prioritized his work over his family, been emotionally unavailable to the point of neglect. I told my mother he'd been controlling about money. I told my sister he'd had anger issues. None of it was true, but it was easier than admitting I'd blown up my family for someone who made me feel special. The lies grew because they had to. When Fletcher asked for joint custody, I told the court he was unstable, obsessed with his computer to the point of neglecting the children's basic needs. I provided examples of times he'd been too busy to help with the babies, conveniently omitting that he'd been desperately trying to build a business that would support us. Julian backed up my story. Having heard my version of events for months, my family believed me because they loved me and wanted to protect their grandchildren. Friends took sides, and most chose mine because I was the primary caretaker, the one who seemed more responsible and grounded. Fletcher was awarded limited visitation, every other weekend and 1 evening per week. I watched him sign the papers with shaking hands, and for a moment I almost took it all back. But Julian was waiting in the hallway, talking about our future together, about giving the twins stability and a proper father figure. Fletcher moved across the country 3 months later. He called the kids regularly at first, sent birthday presents and holiday cards. But Chloe and Mason were barely 2 years old, and I made sure those conversations were brief and supervised. I told them Daddy was busy with work, that he'd moved away because his job was more important to him than they were. Julian and I married when the twins were 4. He adopted them legally, and they became Chloe and Mason Whitmore. I told them their biological father had signed away his rights because he didn't want the responsibility of children. They stopped asking about him eventually. The years passed, and the lies became more elaborate. When Chloe had nightmares at age 6 and asked why some kids at school lived with both their real parents, I told her it was because some daddies weren't safe to be around. "Your first daddy used to get very angry," I said, stroking her hair. "He would yell and throw things when he was frustrated. Julian would never do that. That's why he's a better daddy for you." I convinced myself I was protecting her from confusion, but really I was protecting myself from her questions. When Mason turned 10 and asked why we never visited Fletcher's side of the family, I escalated the fiction further. "Your biological father had problems controlling his temper," I explained. He scared me sometimes, and I was worried he might scare you too. That's why we had to leave, to keep you both safe." Mason's eyes went wide with the gravity of this revelation, and I watched him process the idea that he'd been rescued from danger he couldn't even remember. The worst lie came when they were teenagers, and Fletcher's Christmas cards started including photos of his new life in Seattle. When Chloe found one that had slipped past my screening, showing Fletcher with his new wife and their young daughter, she asked why he looked so happy if he was such a bad person. "Some people are very good at hiding who they really are," I told her, my voice heavy with manufactured sadness. "Your father could be charming and successful in public, but behind closed doors, he was different. Angry, unpredictable. I'm just grateful we got away before you were old enough to remember how frightening he could be." I watched my daughter's face close off as she processed this image of her biological father as someone dangerous, someone to be feared rather than mourned. Fletcher sent Christmas cards until the twins turned 10, then birthday cards until they turned 16. I intercepted most of them, though occasionally one would slip through. When Chloe asked about a card that arrived on her 14th birthday, I told her it was probably guilt, that some people send money or gifts to make themselves feel better about their choices. "Why doesn't he ever call?" she asked. "Because he knows it would confuse you," I said. "It's better this way." I told myself I was protecting them. Children need stability, not complications. Fletcher had made his choice when he moved away. I was just helping them understand reality, but reality, as it turns out, has a way of revealing itself. The twins turned 18 last fall and started asking more direct questions about their biological father. Mason wanted to know about medical history for college health forms. Chloe was curious about family names and heritage for a genealogy project. I gave them the same edited version I'd been telling for years. Fletcher had been too focused on his career to prioritize family, had moved away when they were small, had chosen his work over his children. But what kind of work? Mason pressed. What did he actually do? "Computer programming," I said dismissively. He was always more interested in machines than people. That's when Mason did what any 18-year-old would do in 2024. He Googled Fletcher Kellerman computer programmer. The results were not what any of us expected. Fletcher hadn't disappeared into obscurity after leaving us. He'd moved to Seattle, finished his inventory management program, and founded a company called Track Systems. The program I dismissed as his obsession had revolutionized how small businesses manage their supply chains. The company had grown steadily over 20 years, acquiring competitors and expanding internationally. And 3 months ago, Track had been purchased by a major corporation for $52 million. Mason found interviews Fletcher had given to tech publications over the years. In every single one, he mentioned his children, how becoming a father had motivated him to build something lasting, how he hoped his kids would understand someday that everything he'd worked for had been for them. "I have twins," he'd told one interviewer in 2015. "I don't get to see them much, but they're the reason I get up every morning. Everything I build, hoping they'll be proud of it someday." Chloe found the court records online. They're all public in our county, available to anyone who knows how to search. She read the custody agreement, Fletcher's request for joint custody, my claims about his instability and neglect. Then she found something I'd forgotten existed. The private investigator's report Fletcher's lawyer had commissioned during our custody battle. It contained interviews with our neighbors, my co-workers, people who'd known us as a couple. Every single person described Fletcher as devoted to his children, hardworking, and heartbroken about our separation. Several mentioned that I'd been seeing someone else. One neighbor specifically recalled Fletcher taking the twins to the park every morning during his unemployment, playing with them for hours while I was at work. The report painted a picture of a man who'd been desperately trying to hold his family together, while his wife was falling in love with someone else. When the twins confronted me with this information, I tried to maintain the narrative I'd built. I said the internet could be deceiving, that court records didn't tell the whole story, that they didn't understand how complicated adult relationships could be. He abandoned you, I insisted. He chose to leave. After you cheated on him, Chloe said quietly. After you lied in court about him being neglectful. After you made it impossible for him to be part of our lives. That's when Mason told me they'd already contacted Fletcher. They'd found his personal website, which included a section called For My Children, with photos, letters, and updates he'd written over the years. Birthday messages he'd never been able to send. School events he'd never been invited to attend. Graduations and achievements he'd celebrated alone. He's been waiting for us, Mason said. He never stopped hoping. The twins met their father last month. They flew to Seattle on their own, using money from part-time jobs they'd saved for months. They spent a week getting to know the man I'd taught them to dismiss as selfish and irresponsible. They came back changed. Not angry exactly, but distant in a way that reminded me painfully of Fletcher himself. They looked at me differently, like they were seeing me clearly for the first time. We're changing our names back, Chloe announced. We want to be Kellermans again. Julian raised you, I protested. He's been your father for 14 years. Julian's a good man, Mason agreed. But Fletcher is our father, and we want his name. The legal documents arrived 2 weeks later, along with the private investigator's report and a letter from Fletcher's attorney. He wasn't seeking back child support or demanding explanations. He simply wanted me to know that his children had contacted him, that he was grateful beyond words for the opportunity to know them, and that he bore me no ill will for the choices I'd made. We all did what we thought was best at the time, the letter concluded. I hope you'll understand that Chloe and Mason are adults now, capable of making their own decisions about their relationships. I look forward to being part of their lives in whatever capacity they'll allow. It was signed simply Fletcher, not Fletcher Kellerman or Mr. Kellerman, or any of the formal signatures that might have conveyed resentment or legal positioning. Just Fletcher, the man I'd once loved and then systematically destroyed because I couldn't face my own failures. I've spent the last month trying to understand how I became the person who could do what I did. How I convinced myself that rewriting history was protecting my children rather than serving my own guilt and fear. The truth is complicated and uncomfortable. I was 24 when our relationship fell apart, overwhelmed by new motherhood and financial stress, desperately lonely in a way that made Fletcher's quiet intensity feel like rejection rather than dedication. I needed emotional connection he didn't know how to provide, and instead of working on our communication, I found it elsewhere. When the affair was discovered, I faced a choice: admit my mistakes and work toward co-parenting with a man I'd hurt deeply, or create a narrative that made me the victim instead of the architect of our family's destruction. I chose the story that let me sleep at night. I chose the version where Fletcher was the problem, where I was protecting my children from his limitations rather than depriving them of his love. For 18 years, that story worked. My kids grew up believing their father had abandoned them, but they also grew up stable and loved. Julian provided consistency and support, even if our marriage eventually ended in divorce when they were in high school. They had good childhoods, successful academic careers, strong relationships with their friends, and extended family. But they didn't have their father, and he didn't have them. Fletcher spent 2 decades building a fortune while missing his children's first steps, first words, school plays, graduation ceremonies, and college applications. He celebrated their achievements from a distance, marking birthdays alone, wondering if they thought about him on Christmas morning. My twins spent 18 years believing their biological father hadn't loved them enough to fight for them, when the truth was that I'd made fighting impossible and loving them from afar his only option. The money changes everything and nothing. Fletcher's success validates what I dismissed as impractical dreaming, but it doesn't undo the lost years or the damage I caused to all of our relationships. The twins will benefit from his financial stability now. He's already set up college funds and talked about helping them with graduate school. But money can't replace the relationship they should have had all along. What hurts most is reading the letters Fletcher wrote to them over the years. posted on his personal website like messages in digital bottles. Birthday wishes for children who never received them. Pride in achievements he learned about through social media stalking. Hopes that someday they'd want to know him. I see your mother in both of you, he wrote on their 16th birthday. Chloe has her determination and Mason has her kindness. I hope that's enough to help you understand that everything I've worked for has been with you in mind. I may not have been able to be your father in the ways that mattered most, but you've been my children every single day. I don't know if Fletcher and I will ever speak directly. The twins say he asks about me sometimes, but not in the way someone asks about an enemy. More like someone asking about a place they used to live, curious but without bitterness. Maybe that's the most devastating part of all this. I spent years justifying my actions by convincing myself that Fletcher was vindictive, that he would have made co-parenting impossible, that protecting the twins from his influence was necessary. But Fletcher responded to losing his children by building something extraordinary and hoping they'd someday be proud of him. He responded to my lies and legal maneuvering with patience and grace, waiting 18 years for a phone call that might never have come. I responded to one mistake, the affair, by compounding it with lies that hurt everyone involved, including myself. The twins are planning to spend Christmas in Seattle this year. Fletcher has a house on the water now, with bedrooms for both of them and photos of their childhood that he somehow obtained despite never being present for those moments. They're excited in a way I haven't seen since they were small. Like they're finally getting to open a present they'd been told was lost. Julian supports their relationship with Fletcher, which somehow makes my own role in this tragedy even clearer. The man who raised them can celebrate their connection to their biological father because he never felt threatened by truth or love or complicated family dynamics. I'm learning to live with the reality of what I've done and who I've been. Not the version I told myself for 18 years, but the actual truth. I was a young woman who made a mistake, panicked about the consequences, and chose to protect myself at the expense of everyone else I claimed to love. Fletcher built a $50 million company during the years he should have been teaching his children to ride bikes and helping with homework. My twins grew up without their father because I couldn't face my own failures as a wife and partner. None of us got what we deserved, but maybe we can still build something honest from what's left. The twins text me from Seattle now, sharing photos of their father's house, stories about the tech industry, updates about half-siblings they're getting to know. Fletcher remarried 5 years ago to a woman who knew about his children and encouraged him to keep hoping. They're building the relationship they should have had all along, and I'm trying to find peace with being the reason it took 18 years to begin. Some mistakes can't be undone, only acknowledged and learned from. I can't give Fletcher back the years he lost with his children, or give my twins back the father they should have known from the beginning. But I can stop lying, to them and to myself. I can admit that sometimes the person we need protection from is ourselves. And sometimes the stories we tell to sleep at night are the ones that cause the most damage in the daylight. Fletcher Kellerman was never the villain in our story. He was a young father doing his best under impossible circumstances, building something lasting for children he hoped would understand someday. I was the one who made the circumstances impossible. I was the one who needed forgiveness, even though I was too proud and too scared to ask for it. Now it's too late for apologies, but not too late for truth. My children know their father, and their father knows them. They carry his name again, and he carries their love. It's more than I gave any of them the right to hope for, and more than I probably deserved to witness. But I'm grateful for it anyway.